Hello and welcome to the video for procedure settings. This is part one of a two-part video dedicated to the many program level settings for procedures. These settings are only available to program administrators with settings access. In this video, we'll cover procedure form settings, procedure types settings, and diagnosis types settings. In the next video, we'll cover the settings for procedure verification, evaluation, and certification. If you navigate from the home page to the Program Settings link, then to the Procedures subtab within Program Settings, you can follow along. First, under the Procedure Form settings, let's discuss the settings around supervisors. Supervisor menu determines which faculty list you want to include in your procedure log's supervisor list. Do you want the list to only include faculty from the program you're currently logged into, or all faculty from your hospital? To include residents in your supervisor list, check the checkbox next to include residents in supervisors list. This will allow you to choose from a list of programs where you can select your residents from. Finally, do you want to force the trainee to identify a supervisor on the log, whether it be a resident or a faculty member? This can be helpful because once a procedure log is submitted, if a supervisor isn't designated initially, no verification requests are generated. Next, let's take a look at some patient information settings. To include the patient information section within the procedure log, check the appropriate checkbox. Only if the patient information section is included in the log can you include the patient ID within that section. Otherwise, patient ID cannot be tracked. Batch procedure entry allows the user to log procedures that usually occur in large quantities, like X-rays for radiology and autopsies for pathology. When you enable batch procedure logging, you receive a notification informing you that verifications are disabled when batch logging, as you cannot define a supervisor. The procedure and diagnosis settings are very similar. Let's examine. The first setting determines the maximum number of procedures or diagnosis types that you'd like to include in the log. You can include up to 20. Please keep in mind that unless you're using batch logging, a log represents a single patient case. This applies to both procedures and diagnoses. The fourth setting is for if you want to require your trainees to select at least one procedure or diagnosis type on their log from the program-defined procedure or diagnosis type list. This applies to both procedures and diagnoses. Residents can log other allows residents to type in custom procedure types. Please keep in mind, requirements cannot be tracked for these other procedures, and reports cannot be generated around quantities logged. This applies to procedures only. The comparable setting for diagnosis is method to record diagnosis. If selected from the list, program defined is selected, diagnosis can only be tracked if the program admin has defined a program-specific diagnosis type list. Finally, we'll discuss roles. Roles are very important in procedure and diagnosis logging. They feed requirements, and for procedures, they can trigger verification. Both procedures and diagnoses, the program admin can decide which roles to allow trainees to assign to procedures and diagnoses. These roles come from an institution-defined list. In this list, ASST, non-plain fact, is an example of an institutionally defined role. To enable a role, simply check the checkbox next to the role and save the settings page. For procedures, you can also enable verification for the selected roles as well. This sends a verification request for procedures logged attributed to the selected role, which also has a supervisor attached. As verification is not a feature for diagnoses, it is not available there.